Premier Li Keqiang in Cuba, the first official visit to the island nation by a Chinese premier since the two countries established diplomatic ties. What came from the historic visit? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. After speaking at the United Nations and visiting Canada, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang wraps up his trip in Cuba. China and Cuba established diplomatic ties nearly 60 years ago and have long shared a close relationship. For more on this historic visit, CCTV's Michael Voss joins us now from Havana. And Michael, China is Cuba's second largest trading partner, and trade between the two countries is up 57% from last year. What kind of economic agreements did we see from this visit?
Well, I think this was very much a visit centered around economic agreements. On Saturday, Premier Li and President Castro witnessed the signing of 30 accords. They covered everything from finance, banking, information, technology, science, agriculture, transport and energy, to name just a few of them. And then on Sunday, there were at least two further signing ceremonies of other agreements. I think here there are three really interesting ones that, in a sense, the Chinese have cherry-picked. There's renewable energy, there's internet, and then there's biotechnology and pharmaceuticals. Cuba at the moment produces just 4% of its electricity from renewable energy. It set itself a goal of boosting that to 24% by 2030 and possibly pushing to make that earlier. Now, there are new donations, grants, if you like, for Cuba to produce solar panels. I went to the solar panel factory last week. Everything they're producing, 60,000 panels a year, are made with Cuban technology, Cuban components. Now there's money on the table for them to triple that and to bring in modern automated machinery. Also, there were accords signed where there are credit lines for Cuba to purchase wind farms and also to build power plants, electrical power plants, using organic waste material from sugarcane, from the sugar production. So that's one key area. China is helping Cuba achieve some energy sustainability and some energy security. Internet. Now, President Barack Obama used his executive powers to open the door for American telecommunications companies to do business with Cuba in internet and internet infrastructure. So far, though, the only deals that have been signed with the Americans are for roaming. Americans can now come here and use their US cell phones. It's China which is building the internet infrastructure. Huawei has opened Wi-Fi hotspots all over the country, and there were further accords to develop that still further. For me, the really interesting one is biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, where for the first time, China is starting to invest in Cuba, as well as just provide loans and credits to buy Chinese materials. Cuba has a very sophisticated biotechnology sector. In these latest agreements, there's one to build a factory at the Special Development Zone at Mariel to make biosensors, for example, for diabetes tests, for export to Latin America. They're going to provide a joint facility to manufacture some of Cuba's very sophisticated anti-cancer drugs. China's providing loans to provide supercomputers to do more research. That is another really interesting field that the Chinese feel that actually there is money to be made and there are good reasons to invest here.
And Michael, apart from economic cooperation, in what other areas do Cuba and China see room for cooperation?
I mean, I think we are seeing the whole relationship move on to a new level. Tourism's on the rise, for example. This year, for the very first time, we've got direct flights coming from Beijing to Havana via Montreal in Canada. That's one side. Another is actually military cooperation. In the last year, we've had China's top general and the head of the Cuban Armed Forces both here looking at cooperation. But I think the really interesting thing is whether we are entering a new phase of relationship, perhaps, where China believes that maybe now is the time to start looking at investment here rather than just loans. I've been asked several times over the last year whether China thought that these new US-Cuban relationships would be a threat to China. And certainly once the US trade embargo is finally lifted, then there is going to be a lot of commercial competition from a large country that's much closer to Cuba than China. However, I think instead of a threat, China sees that this newfound relationship with the United States actually a challenge and an opportunity to get a foot in the door here before American companies arrive in large numbers. And the fact that the European banks are still unwilling to do business, to do trade, to finance anything in Cuba for fear of being fined by the United States. The Chinese feel they've got a foot in the door to move in here before anybody else.
Okay, thanks, Michael. That's CCTV's Michael Voss reporting from Havana. Joining us now for more on Chinese-Cuban relations from Beijing, Gio Dong is a senior research fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. From Havana, Cristina Escobar is a Cuban television anchor, journalist, and political analyst. And from New York, Ted Henkin is a professor at the City University of New York and co-author of the book Entrepreneurial Cuba, The Changing Policy Landscape. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's start with Gio Dong in Beijing. Gio Dong, we heard from our reporter about the dozens of economic and trade agreements that Premier Li Keqiang signed with the Cubans during his visit. But what is the political and diplomatic significance of this visit?
Premier Li Keqiang's visit to Cuba is continuation of a tradition of senior level exchanges between China and Cuba. We know that 2 years ago, President Xi Jinping visited Cuba. So Li's visit actually was meant to build upon the previous successes of progress of relations between the two countries and move forward with enhanced political trust. I believe that during the visit, Premier Li actually had the chance to learn firsthand the progress of reform in Cuba and Cuba's thinking about its strategy for development, its ideas on international relations, on regional situation. So this provided a very good opportunity for Premier Li to confer with leaders of Cuba about both domestic and international situations. This will actually help the two countries forge closer political ties.
Christina, how would you characterize the relationship between Cuba and China? You know, as we've been reporting, it's a very important economic relationship, but what about the political side of that?
Well, I think China provides to Cuba a very important opportunity in terms of commercial interchange, and also because China performs internationally in a very interesting way and important for Cuba, because China does not preconceived political agendas in the countries China goes to actually create any kind of investment or any kind of new link. So that's very important, because Cuba has been very pressured, been under a lot of pressure because of the blockade from the United States, that actually what means is that is a preconceived agenda of how Cuba should be in order to have relations with the US. It's not the case with China. So politically speaking, it's very important, essentially in these days in which a lot of international media and important relevant voices in the US and internationally are talking about how Cuba is closer to the US, which is true, but not that close, because the policy that actually prohibits Cuba to act normally, to perform normally, internationally speaking, in terms of economy and how to deal with other countries and how even to use dollars is still in place. That policy from the US is still in place. So having China closer in terms of politics, receiving this for very first time, this Prime Minister of China here, is very important, because it means that Cuba is continuing this path, very smart path, by the way, of diversifying its commercial partners around the world, not always thinking about if there's an absolute coincidence, politically speaking. But I think in terms of China, it's very important, because it's not only how many opportunity gives for Cuba in a lot of senses, it also means that it's a partner in which Cuba can trust, and this is very important because it's not the case with the U.S. And also a long history of interchange between Cuba and China that has provided a lot of important and, let's say, safety net in terms of what we have Chinese in Cuba. The buses that we have in Cuba on our streets are Chinese. The digital television that we watch are with Chinese decoders. So all of that means that for the Cuban people, China link is very important, and having this new step, politically speaking, is very interesting. And I do think I don't think it's the beginning because we have a lot, but it's a relaunching of this relation, and in moments in which Cuba needs a lot of partners, and essentially such a strong partner as China.
Ted, given that the United States and Cuba are now trying to restore relations, both diplomatic and economic, are we going to, in the future, see some kind of competition between the United States and China for influence, for more of a relationship with Cuba?
I think it's undoubtable that we will see this competition for influence. I don't think it's necessarily a negative thing. I think it actually gives Cuba a bit of leverage that they have many suitors lining up to do business, to interact, to influence them, whether it's Japan, China, Iran, Russia, or the United States. Obviously, the U.S.-Cuba relationship is like the elephant in the living room, given the long and problematic history between the two countries and the 2-year-old new policy between the countries to move toward normalization. I think there are some important areas where there is competition, and Cuba has a choice about which way to go. I think that Christina is absolutely right that dealing with China is much easier because there is an implicit respect for a similar political system. But I think that not dealing or choosing not to deal with the United States in certain areas may also be disconnecting Cuba in the future from newer markets. Obviously, the embargo is a big impediment to that, but the areas that have been opened up for trade and investment, I think Cuba has so far shown a reluctance because there's a fear, I think a well-founded fear, that more opening with the United States is a potential Trojan horse. Raul Castro said it himself during the Party Congress in April when he talked about not being naive in terms of some of the intentions behind empowerment of the private sector. At the same time, it's very ironic, given that China has made fundamental economic changes, letting its private sector grow and take over big parts of the economy, whereas Cuba is in its infancy in that area, even though there's been significant reform in the last 5 years.
Gio Dong, as Ted points out, part of the respect that these two countries have for each other may come from the fact that they have similar political systems. But during his visit there, Premier Li Keqiang said that he wanted to intensify mutual political trust. Those were his words. What does that mean?
It is China's fundamental principle for its diplomacy that its diplomacy is not ideology based, and however, ideology plays some role in its China's relations with countries, and of course, both China and Cuba now follow a socialist path. Of course, they have different national conditions, so they have actually this provides a chance for them to learn from each other in finding approaches to the economy, to their social progress, and how to share how to tackle problems facing the two countries. However, that being said, it is the common shared national interest which drive them closer and together. We know that in the past, previously in history actually, shortly after the two countries established diplomatic ties, the same kind of ideology did not move them closer because of the differences on how to deal with the former Soviet Union. And but later on, after the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the two countries found out that actually the two continue to enjoy shared interests, especially, political and economically. Politically, yes, they are both socialist countries, and they have a lot of to share with each other in terms of experiences or even lessons how to move along with the socialist path. But more importantly is actually the economic interest now, which plays a key role for the bilateral relations. For example, China now can work with Cuba on key areas of cooperation, like biotechnology, infrastructure, agriculture, machinery, telecommunications, and so forth, and actually helps Cuba improve its conditions for economic development and to help Cuba achieve sustainable development and even create more jobs. In the past, China simply exported manufactured goods to Cuba. Now we have a new thinking, a new way of developing the bilateral relations. That is to invest more in Cuba, and so that means that the two countries have now potentials for even closer relations. So yes, indeed, ideology plays some role, but shared interests, national interests, play an even bigger role.
Okay, we are going to take a break right now. Coming up, we will continue to look at how China can help Cuba as the island nation continues to open up to the rest of the world. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about China-Cuba relations as Chinese Premier Li Keqiang wraps up a visit to the Caribbean nation. Let's get back to our panel. And Christina, this was a high-level visit, of course, when the leaders of two countries met each other. But how do ordinary Cubans see a visit like this? Was there much interest in the visit by the Chinese premier? And have Cuban relations with China impacted ordinary Cubans?
Well, a lot, actually, because a lot of the things that the government, a lot of the policies, social policies to create subsidized services are sustained with Chinese products. I'm talking about, for example, digital decoder, as I mentioned, induction cookers, public transportation. The vast majority of the modern cars that we have in Cuba are Chinese cars. The refrigerators are Chinese. So a lot of these social policies that the government still have in place to subsidize and help the Cuban people are possible because of the Chinese products. So that means that people are very interested in what these opportunities means with the visit of the Prime Minister. And then, of course, the fact that people are kind of afraid that we could fall into the gravity zone that means this new link with the U.S. Why? Well, it's very easy to understand why. In the past, we're too close, 90 miles away only. U.S. companies are very big. And in the past, Cuba was absolutely under this kind of power. And the idea of having another very important country, very powerful country near to us in terms of providing investment in essential infrastructure, people see that as a very good thing. So it's a good news in general to have good relations with China, because we're part of the global society, a lot of things are Chinese, and essentially the affordable things and the things subsidized by the state are Chinese. That's why people are very excited with this kind of opportunity. And it's interesting and it's very, very wise to have a very powerful country like China in the same scenario that the U.S. companies wants to enter. They're not here yet, but they know that they're going to have competition, as Professor Henken said. And this is very important because it's not only a leverage for Cuba, it's also an opportunity to say where is the better deal. It doesn't have to be exactly at 90 miles away, even though it's closer. It could be with China or other countries, not only the countries that Professor Henken mentioned, but others like, for example, Saudi Arabia. Cuba has good relations with Saudi Arabia. Actually, the updating of the water pipelines in the east part of the country is being made with credits of Saudi Arabia. So it's part of this strategy of diversifying our commercial partners, and I think that's very wise in the sense that Cuba has acknowledged several times that we do need foreign investment, whatever that foreign investment comes from, obviously with senses of respect and where the opportunity is better for Cuba.
Ted, we heard our reporter say in his report at the beginning of the show that he detected that this visit by the Chinese premier was a turning point, that it marked something of a new era. In fact, the Chinese premier himself said during the visit that this was time for a new direction in relations with Cuba, and that he pledged to inject a new dynamic in relations. So how do you see this relationship evolving now?
Well, I would be very interested to hear from Christina, who lives in Cuba, what her perception was about the different reception of the premier just in the last 2 days versus in March when President Obama came, because we often talk about that as a turning point, a historic visit. I think that the relationship with China is positive in that it gives Cuba, as Christina said, another option of a powerful country that it can trade with. Cuba can diversify its relationships and therefore have more power in choosing the best deal for Cuba. However, I think there's two challenges or problems potential with dealing with China. One is that China could potentially become a new dependency for Cuba, as it was with the Soviet Union and previously with the United States. And I think that Cuban leaders will be intelligent to take out the benefits from the relationship with China without becoming too dependent. A second issue that I think is to be concerned about has to do with telecommunications technology and Cuba following the Chinese model of the internet. I think that for now, the Wi-Fi hotspots and many of the cell phones that are popular in Cuba and spreading in Cuba are Chinese technology. Huawei is very instrumental in spreading the technology in these Wi-Fi hotspots. However, China has successfully, many ways, remade the internet. I think that the Cuban people deserve access to that technology, but maybe the Chinese model makes the Cuban government happy, but maybe it's not a good deal for the Cuban people. So I think that, I would keep looking at offers from the United States. The United States, of course, does not have its hands clean. It engages in mass surveillance, as was revealed by Edward Snowden. And so, any dealings with the United States and its tech companies need to be done with the eyes wide open. But I think that the Chinese deal also comes with a certain model that may not be in Cuba's best interests.
Right, Christina, let's get back to the point that Ted talked about, that Cuba could become over-dependent on China in a similar way that it was dependent on the Soviet Union. Is that a risk?
Well, first of all, we do have to pay for the things that China provides. So with money. So it's not the same conditions as we had with the USSR, because we had it was a different model of trade. So even though we do have privileged, let's say, situation with China in terms of credit, in terms of how we pay for that, we do pay for that. So if another country brings a better option, of course, we will take the other country opportunity. So I don't see that happening. I think China has taken advantage of a situation of the embargo, because China has, let's say, go bypassing a lot of times the embargo, because of how powerful it is and how it can do it, even though sometimes even they do violate some of the legislation that extraterritorially the U.S. applies to the world, a policy that should be bilateral, but the U.S. applies that to the entire world. China has bypassed that several times, and in this case that gives a leverage to Beijing. But I don't see that happening because it's not the same model of trade. In any case, it's something that we could watch, and in a scenario of no embargo, of the embargo being lifted, I think that China will also receive some competition from other countries. And in what Professor Henken was saying is very interesting about internet and the model that we have. Even though it's of course better to use the technology and the know-how experience of China in terms of technology and accessing internet much better than doing it with the U.S., a country that is difficult for any country to trust to in this sense. I do believe that the model that Cuba is developing is very Cuban, is very related to our conditions, and now is essentially an infrastructural problem. And that's why China is so important in this sense because Huawei and other companies' technology is important. Cuba has partnered before with other countries in technology, not having good experiences in that sense. That's why the opportunity that China provides could be interesting in terms of technology and infrastructure. I don't think the model that China uses is something that Cuba is going to copy because the conditions and society are quite different. But there are a lot of challenges, and we could go on that afterwards. There's a lot of challenges that China faced in the past during the reforms that Cuba is facing now, as Professor Tehenken was saying about the private sector. How big should be, how censored should be in the society is something that in any case Cuba could learn from China, not copying the model. Copying models never works. We've lived that in our experiences, but in any case learning from how China has solved that is very interesting.
Gio Dong, the Chinese ambassador to Cuba recently said that ties between China and Cuba spearhead or exemplify the broader relationship of China's relationship with Latin America. Explain that to us. Why is the relationship with Cuba so important when we look at the broader context of China's relationship with Latin America?
Actually, China has been forging closer ties with all parts of the world, including developing countries and developing countries like the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America and the Caribbean states. You know, China is the biggest developing country. Certainly, we have shared aspirations with other developing countries, and in Latin America, so China would like to forge close ties with these fellow developing countries, and Cuba is a very important member of CELAC, the Latin America and Caribbean states community. You know that China just established a forum with Latin America and Caribbean states, which actually modeled on the successful China-Africa forum and the successful China Gulf states, Arab states forum. So, and also Cuba is an important member of the non-aligned movement. So even though Cuba is a small country compared with China, it has only 11 million people, half of actually the population of Beijing. And China really attaches importance to its relation with Cuba, not only economically but also politically. And Cuba can play a bridge between China and the states in Latin America and the Caribbean states. And actually that is what has happened in the relations between China and Cuba. And China-Cuba have very close consultations, not only on bilateral relations, but also on regional issues in that region, also in China relation with developing countries. So Cuba means a lot of things for China, right, both bilaterally and regionally.
Okay, and that's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. Chat with us about this or any other show on Twitter. We're at CCTV_America. We also use Facebook. Find us at facebook.com/CCTV America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.